Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon for our webinar talking about abuse, neglect, and exploitation and the Ombudsman's role in looking at those allegations of abuse. We are honored and thrilled to have Amity Overall here with us from the National Ombudsman's Resource Center to be our presenter this afternoon. And in just a minute, I'll let her have the electronic podium, so to speak. But first, just a couple of housekeeping-y kinds of things that I'd like to share with you all. Wanted to remind you all that we are able to host this webinar and future webinars this year through a grant from the Kansas Volunteer Commission. We've received a grant to pay for basically the platform for 1 year, so we're very excited about that and are grateful to them, and that's why you see their logo on all of our promotional emails and things that have been about this webinar. You should be able to see a screen that looks pretty much like this, and I wanted to point out a couple of things that your lines are all muted right now. Later on, there'll be some opportunities for some discussion questions, and so if you want to participate in the discussion or have some questions to ask, you can either raise your hand using the hand icon or type in your questions in the question box. And I also wanted to make sure that each of you knew that this webinar is being recorded, and the goal of that then is to be able to make it available to the folks who can't be here, and for future Ombudsman volunteers that join our program. So we're excited to be able to do that and to reach not just the folks on the line today, but others in the future as well. As I said, this is a grant that we received to be able to do these on a regular basis, and we have tentatively chosen moving forward the third Tuesday of each month at 1 o'clock, so you can kind of put that on your calendar. Our next webinar will be November 17th at 1 p.m., and it will be on improving dementia care in Kansas. Our speaker will be Linda Farrar, who will share some current standards and approaches that might help improve dementia care for our folks. Linda is a nurse and a long-term care administrator. She's retired from all of that and is now a consultant and is also the head of the Kansas Partnership for Better Dementia Care. So we're excited to have her coming and speaking to us. And so that's all I got. I want to not waste any more of your time listening to me and turn this over to Amity.
Thank you, Barbara. Just 1 second, everyone, and I'll show you my slides. All right. Thank you so much for the introduction, and I'm really excited that you're going to have a full year's worth of monthly webinars through that grant. That is fantastic. So, as Barbara said, I'm from the National Ombudsman Resource Center, and today we're talking about the role of ombudsmen when responding to allegations of abuse. We are going to cover a lot of information today because whenever I have an opportunity to speak directly with local ombudsmen and program representatives and state ombudsman as well, I try to maximize on that. So I am going to go fairly quickly. However, I will send my PowerPoints with my speaker notes to Barbara to share with you guys after the presentation, as well as any other questions. I'm happy to respond to follow-up questions if we don't get to all of them today. So I'm certainly available at your convenience whenever you need me at the Resource Center. So we are going to talk a little bit about an overview of complaints involving abuse. I wanted to give you an idea, just a snapshot of what that looks like in the complaint data at the national level and in Kansas. And then we're going to talk, of course, about the federal requirements, both the Older Americans Act and the final Ombudsman Program Rule, and how that applies to abuse allegations, complaints. We're going to talk about some cases, some actual scenarios, and advocacy strategies related to those. Then I'll open it up for some question and answer, just general questions that you have. We'll close out the webinar touching on systems advocacy, because I think that's an important component of all Ombudsman work, and then of course close out and identify some available resources that we have at the Resource Center for you. So throughout the webinar, I'm going to have 3 questions that I'm just going to pose to you, and I'd like to have a virtual sense of your response. So instead of opening all the lines, I'd rather you raise your hand in response to this question and the others that I'll ask a little later. Have you ever investigated a case involving an allegation of abuse, neglect, or exploitation? If you'll just look on your control panel and click the raise hand icon. Just want to get a general sense of what we're working with today. Great, thank you. I see, let's see, four hands raised so far. So certainly not the majority, but that definitely gives me an idea, and I think this is helpful for those that either have investigated those complaints or possibly will in the future. So thank you. So what are we talking about today? These definitions are from the Older Americans Act, and they're basically the same in the federal nursing home regs. State regulations for assisted living probably have similar definitions, as these are really universally used when discussing abuse of vulnerable adults. So abuse is defined as the willful infliction of injury, unreasonable confinement, intimidation, or cruel punishment resulting in physical harm, pain, or mental anguish. The important takeaway for the definition of abuse, I think, is that it's willful, and that's the line in determining whether it's abuse or not. Neglect is the deprivation by a person, including a caregiver, of goods or services that are necessary to avoid physical harm, mental anguish, or mental illness. And then exploitation is the illegal or improper act or process of an individual, including a caregiver, in using the resources of an older adult for monetary or personal benefit, profit, or gain. You may have been aware that there have been countless newspaper headlines, studies, hearings, and reports on elder abuse and neglect, and there has been an increased focus on preventing and responding to elder abuse in the last few years. These statistics on this slide are based on data and reports of elder abuse of individuals living in the community. However, we all know that abuse occurs in facilities as well, and that it is underreported just as it is in the community. Abuse, regardless of the setting, significantly impacts the quality of life and care of those involved. And individuals in facilities today are often sicker, frailer, and more vulnerable than in the past. So it's estimated that 1 in 10 elders experience some form of abuse, whether that's abuse, neglect, or exploitation. And only 1 in every 23 cases are reported. As many as 1 in 2 individuals with dementia are victims of abuse. And another important statistic is that family, friends, and caregivers are the perpetrators in 70 to 90% of all abuse. So we may hear a lot about scams, you know, those stranger scams that they may email a grandparent and pretend to be a grandchild, or call a grandparent and pretend to be a grandchild. And we may think that financial exploitation is all of those types of stranger scams, but it's not. As you can see, family, friends, and caregivers, those that are known to the victims, are perpetrators in 70 to 90% of all abuse. And financial exploitation is the fastest growing form of elder abuse, and it is grossly underreported. So what type of abuse is occurring in nursing homes? You may notice on this slide, just to let you know, the 2014 national data, which is the National Ombudsman Reporting System data, is not available publicly yet, so I had to draw from the 2013 data nationally, but I do have the 2014 Kansas data thanks to Barbara. So there were over 9,000 complaints of abuse in Category A. And I do know that some of you, if you're a volunteer ombudsman on the line with us today, that you don't code your complaints. So I want to make sure to explain that Category A complaints simply means that it is willful abuse and it's a complaint against the facility. So it's not a family member and a complaint against a family member of an instance of abuse that happened outside of the facility. it's a complaint against facility staff. Either the staff actually willfully caused the abuse, neglect, or exploitation, or they could have and should have prevented it from happening. So nearly 10,000 complaints. The top complaint in that category was physical abuse, and the second one was resident-to-resident physical or sexual abuse. In Kansas, last fiscal year, 2014, you had 43 complaints in the same category, and the top was verbal or psychological abuse, and the second was resident-to-resident physical or sexual abuse. What type of abuse is occurring in assisted living facilities? Nationally, again, in 2013, almost 4,000 complaints in this category. The top one was verbal or psychological abuse, and the second was physical abuse. They're actually tied at 23%. So right under that is gross neglect. For you in Kansas, you had 8 complaints. The top one with 3 complaints were about verbal and psychological abuse, and then the second, similar to in the nursing home setting, was resident-to-resident physical or sexual abuse. Resident conflict. Depending on the situation, resident conflict could escalate to abuse, and regardless of whether it's considered willful abuse or not, these conflicts can have a lasting negative impact on a resident's quality of life and care. So this really is an important issue that needs to be addressed. As we see more facilities admitting residents with varying needs, such as younger residents with mental health needs or more residents with dementia, it's quite possible that we'll see an increase of resident conflict. So resident conflict in 2013, this is the national data in NORS, code I-66, which again, I recognize you all don't, not all of you code the complaints, but to give you an idea, code 66 for resident conflict means any complaint involving conflict between residents, which could include roommate conflict or inappropriate behaviors that impact another resident's quality of life. The important takeaway from this is that the resident conflict complaint was among the top 10 complaints for both nursing homes and assisted livings in 2013. It was the 4th highest complaint in nursing homes and 6th highest complaint in assisted living. And looking at the Kansas data in your state, it was the 7th ranked complaint in both the nursing home setting and the assisted living setting. So it's pretty high up there when you compare it to your other complaints. And also in 2013, both nationally and in your state, there were more complaints of resident conflict than any other abuse code in Category A. So again, I think this is a really, really important issue that Ombudsman could really make a significant impact in lives of residents by taking this on. Financial exploitation. In 2013, there were more complaints about financial exploitation by someone other than facility staff. Both received in nursing homes and assisted living nationally and in Kansas than complaints about financial exploitation against facility staff. So meaning a family member, the resident's family member or friend or guardian, responsible party, so on and so forth. There were more complaints against someone not related to the facility for financial exploitation than there were against facility staff for financial exploitation. And looking at those numbers, it's quite a significant difference. As you may know, many of these complaints are usually discovered after a resident receives a discharge notice for non-payment. And as you can see nationally, the number of complaints regarding financial exploitation by someone other than the facility staff, which is in that P121 code column, were more than double than those by facility staff in nursing homes and almost more than triple in assisted living facilities. So financial exploitation and resident conflicts, I think, would be really great areas of focus for Ombudsman in providing information and consultation to facilities, residents, and families in order to help reduce these incidents of both financial exploitation and resident conflict. So like I said, we are today going to talk a bit about federal requirements for the Ombudsman program because these set the stage and the framework for how the program should operate. As you know, the Older Americans Act is the federal law that sets the framework for the role and responsibility of Ombudsman programs across the country. Amendments to the Older Americans Act in 1978 required all states to establish a nursing home ombudsman program. And then amendments to the Act in 1981 expanded ombudsman services to board and care facilities and changed the name of the program to Long-Term Care Ombudsman Program. Despite these amendments in the 70s and 80s, there haven't been any federal regulations for the Ombudsman Program until the final rule was published in February of this year. So, due to the lack of federal regulatory guidance, there are significant variations in how states interpreted the Older Americans Act and implemented the program. So, for example, specific to abuse, some state programs are considered mandatory reporters, and a very small number of state programs receive allegations of abuse and investigate to gather evidence to prove the abuse occurred, meaning they serve as the official finder of fact agency, which we'll talk a little bit about later in the presentation. The final rule is not effective until July 1, 2016, so states are currently reviewing the rule, seeking technical assistance, and determining what changes need to be made in order to be in compliance. In the Older Americans Act, I'm sure you're really familiar with this, so I'm just going to touch on it briefly. In Section 712A3, it states that the Ombudsman shall, either the Ombudsman personally or through representatives of the office, meaning local representatives, identify, investigate, and resolve complaints that are made by or on behalf of residents and relate to action, inaction, or decisions that may adversely affect the health, safety, welfare, or rights of the residents. It goes further to say that the Ombudsman also shall represent the interests of residents before governmental agencies and seek administrative, legal, and other remedies to protect the health, safety, welfare, and rights of residents. So I brought up those two slides with that language just to reiterate that Ombudsmen investigate the individual complaints, and on the second slide, they also act in systems advocacy to change the system, and they present the resident interest before governmental agencies and seek those changes. The final rule expands on the intent of the Older Americans Act and gives a lot more detail regarding the role of the Ombudsman Program, including the role and responsibilities related to responding to allegations of abuse. In addition to the language of the final rule, the Administration on Aging's responses to comments on the proposed rule that were published with the final rule give even more insight to the role of the Ombudsman Program. I strongly encourage you to review their responses because they may be helpful to you when you're responding to questions about the role and duties of the program, or just in general want a better understanding of certain aspects of the final rule. So question number 2. If you haven't put your hand down, let me see if I can actually put it down on my end. Yeah, there we go. All right. If you'll, by a show of hand, raise your hand virtually if you've ever witnessed the abuse of a long-term care resident, whether it be physical, mental, verbal, if you've ever witnessed any abuse of a resident. Raise your hand. Okay, I see a couple. 3. Okay, thank you. The reason I asked about this specific situation is because the rule directly addresses the situation, and it is the first time there's ever been clear federal guidance for the appropriate response of an ombudsman if they witness abuse, and we will talk about that a little later on. So thank you for answering the question. So in 1327-19, Duties of Representatives, since the law didn't specifically state that ombudsmen investigate complaints of abuse, and the law I'm referring to, the Older Americans Act, it didn't exclude it from doing so either. So the final rule specifically states that these complaints are included in ombudsman work, but the focus of an ombudsman investigation is different than other entities. Whether the investigation involves abuse or any other complaint, the purpose of the ombudsman investigation is to resolve the complaint to the resident's satisfaction and protect the resident's health, welfare, and rights. So it's a resident-directed complaint investigation process regardless of what the complaint is, and that's a very important takeaway. So again, in 1327-19 of the final rule, it says that the Ombudsman and representatives of the office serve the resident of a long-term care facility. And the office shall investigate complaints, including but not limited to a complaint related to abuse, neglect, or exploitation for the purposes of resolving the complaint to the resident's satisfaction and to protect them. 1327-19 goes a bit further when they talk about disclosure, because similar to the Older Americans Act not specifically stating that ombudsmen investigate abuse, it was also silent on the issue of whether ombudsmen report and disclose information when a resident is unable to communicate consent in cases of abuse. So the final rule clearly states that it prohibits programs from disclosing information even regarding suspected abuse, neglect, or exploitation without informed consent. It goes further to explain that an ombudsman must assist a resident with referral and disclose information if the goals of the resident or resident representative are for regulatory and protective services or law enforcement action, and it may assist with referral, provide information, or disclose information to other entities with residents to assist with resident goals. So the may and the must is really important to pay attention to. And it goes a little bit further to explain all the caveats in the situation where an ombudsman may refer and disclose information. You have to meet all these qualifiers. So oftentimes ombudsmen would be faced with a suspicion of abuse or an allegation of abuse, yet the resident could not provide informed consent, and they may not have a resident representative, a legal representative. So ombudsmen would not really understand how to proceed with that because there wasn't federal guidance for that. So the final rule clarifies that an ombudsman may refer and disclose resident information to appropriate agencies if the resident's unable to communicate informed consent and does not have a resident representative, there's reasonable cause to believe that an action, inaction, or decision may adversely affect the health, safety, or welfare of that resident. There's no evidence that the resident would not want the referral, and there's reasonable cause to believe that it's in the best interest of that resident, and the representative of the office either obtains ombudsman approval, meaning the state ombudsman approval, or follows the state ombudsman program policies and procedures in how to proceed in this situation. So it very, very clearly states how an ombudsman should proceed in these situations. And like I said a few slides ago, the final rule also addresses situations when an ombudsman witnesses abuse, gross neglect, or exploitation. As the Older Americans Act was really silent on this issue. And unfortunately, as you saw with those hands raised, some ombudsmen have witnessed abuse, and then we really needed clarification on how to proceed with that because there was not a standard process really across the country. So the final rule says that the ombudsman shall seek resident consent and then, of course, follow that resident direction if the resident's able to provide that. If the resident cannot provide informed consent and they're unbefriended, meaning they don't have a legal representative, the resident or the ombudsman shall open the case with ombudsman serving as the complainant, and then, of course, follow your complaint resolution procedures and refer and disclose information to facility management and or appropriate agency if, again, there's no evidence that the resident would not want it to be referred, there's reasonable cause to believe the disclosure would be in the best interest of the resident, and the resident obtains state ombudsman approval or follows state program policies and procedures. So I bring these slides to you because it's really important that there's finally some federal guidance and clarification in these tough situations. As you can see, this gives the Ombudsman program guidance in handling these situations, but at the same time, make sure that the Ombudsman program is still resident-focused and resident-centered in its complaint investigation and resolution process. So earlier, I sent Barbara some brief case scenarios for you to review ahead of time before the webinar. and I have them here available on my slides as well. So what we're going to do with this is I think it may be best either I'll ask the case, review the case with you, and then ask you to respond and thinking about how you would respond in this situation. You can either type your comments in the chat box on your computer, or you can raise your hand and we can unmute your line so you can share your response with us. So let's go ahead and get started with the first case. In the first situation, a resident informs you, the Ombudsman, of an allegation of abuse or financial exploitation, but does not give you permission to pursue the complaint. So how would you handle that situation, or how would you advise that your volunteer ombudsman handle that situation? And feel free again to send your feedback in the chat box or raise your hand and we can unmute your line. I'll give you a couple minutes to think about it. Hi, Gloria. I see that your hand is raised. I'm going to go ahead and unmute your line. All right, go ahead, Gloria. Hello?
Okay, are you talking to me?
Yes, I am. Did you have your hand raised to answer this case?
No. No.
Okay, then I'll go ahead and lower your hand, unless you want to share with us.
On this case, I would start by asking the resident why they don't want to pursue the complaint and see if we could figure that out and work on, you know, that and until we could decide, you know, answer all the questions about why they don't want to pursue, and maybe be able to work them around to where they do want to pursue who's abusing them.
Absolutely. Well, I saw your hand raised, and I'm glad that I asked you to speak because, yes, that's exactly where we start, Gloria. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and mute your line now. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. So, yes, as Gloria said, the first step would be exploring the reason for the resident's reluctance, discussing their right, share the role of the Ombudsman program and how you would support them through the complaint investigation process and resolution process. And it's important to also share with them the potential risk of not reporting the complaint, not only to themselves, but potentially to other individuals living in that facility. You could also offer to investigate without revealing that individual's identity. And then, of course, you would want to visit that person as frequently as possible and then continue to ask if maybe they would be interested in pursuing that complaint at that time. See if the resident either needs or is interested in supportive services such as counseling based on whatever their whatever that incident was. And of course, continue to encourage her to give consent to report the abuse. You could also ask if she shared this information with anyone else, and if so, if she would want that person involved in the complaint investigation and resolution process. Maybe that would give her more confidence if she confided in maybe her daughter or another friend or even another resident, and maybe you could all work together as a team. See if there's other residents with the same issue. Of course, you would go around and ask questions without identifying that resident that wanted it to remain confidential. And then, of course, you'd gather information regarding the allegation. And if you find information supporting her allegation, you could share that information with the facility if it's possible to do so without identifying that resident. So, for example, you could say, you know, Miss Administrator, I have uncovered some information that supports allegations we've received about the night nurse aide named Jackie is doing X, Y, and Z, or has been overheard to do this, etc., and remind the facility of their responsibility to investigate and report that allegation. So the important thing about Ombudsman work is there's a variety of tools and strategies that you can use in resolving a case, even those that involve a resident that does not want to give you consent in pursuing it. Ombudsman must employ other advocacy strategies when responding to allegations of abuse. And when responding to allegations of abuse, Ombudsman should exhaust all possible advocacy strategies, because it's not just the safety of that one complainant resident, but really for the safety of all residents. So I don't want you to walk away from reading the final rule or from this webinar thinking that if you don't get consent, there's not, you can't do anything as an ombudsman, because that's really not true. There are a lot of different ways that you can still advocate on behalf of that individual and protect their safety and the safety of others. We just have to be a bit creative, to say the least. And of course, you would also want to speak with your ombudsman supervisor, whether if you're a volunteer, it'd be that local person, or the local person speaking with the state office. So definitely keep them in the loop. Okay, well, thank you so much. Let's move to the second case. So the second case involves a resident that cannot provide consent. So an ombudsman receives a complaint regarding abuse or gross neglect, and the resident cannot provide consent to pursue that complaint. So how would you proceed in that situation?
How would they find out in the first place? Just the behavior of the person or something?
Yeah, I can hear someone talking, so you may want to mute your line. All the lines are muted on my end, but okay. So I see a Howard Dyer with this hand raised. I'm going to go ahead and unmute your line. All right, Howard, if you want to respond.
Well, I commented on the last situation, and what I said then, I typed something in there, but I would contact the DPOA, if there is one, to discuss the situation and get the DPOA involved.
The DPOA, meaning?
Meaning the person who has power of attorney.
Oh, the power of attorney. Okay.
You're the power of attorney person.
Okay, sorry. Obviously I heard POA, but I hadn't heard DPOA. But yeah, thanks for sharing that, Howard. And if that was with the first case, even if the resident has a durable power of attorney or any power of attorney, if the resident has capacity and can share information with you and tell you not to share it with anyone else, you couldn't share that even with the durable power of attorney unless the resident gave you permission to do that.
Correct.
Yeah. So, but yes, definitely, if the resident gives you permission to contact that power of attorney, that would be a great idea and a great asset in kind of rallying around that resident and pursuing the complaint. So yeah, absolutely. Thank you. And I'm sorry I missed that in the question field. I'm sorry about that.
I think we have, Amity, I think there's several responses to the last scenario in the question field, and then one on this one as well.
Okay. I'm going to have to undock that so I can see.
I can tell you what they are.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
The first one was asking us, I think, in general about the idea that we need resident approval to report abuse, and it's a question. But I think maybe we've answered that question at this point, I hope.
Yes, we do. We need resident approval to report abuse. So I'm going to hit on that a bit more throughout the rest of the presentation, and if there still needs more clarification, then let's definitely talk about that in the Q&A.
And then we had someone that reinforced, I think, what we'd already talked about, that they'd continue to visit with the resident and gain their trust and get more information and do their best to encourage the resident. That, I think, was on the last question.
Great, yeah.
And on this,
Great. Okay.
On this one, we've got that they would learn who the guardian or conservative or power of attorney was, and then begin there, which is similar to what Bates had to say. And if that doesn't work, then move on to talk to try to social services or some other folks. So.
Yep. Great. Absolutely. Thank you. I'm sorry, I forgot to check the questions actually, so that's my fault. But yeah, you're right. The person that said check with the guardian, conservator, or the DPOA and start there. And if that doesn't work, then certainly you could pursue the complaint as an ombudsman complaint, especially if you feel like you go to speak to that person and you feel like they're not doing what's in the best interest of the resident, whether it's a guardianship ward relationship or a legal representative resident relationship, then you would proceed in investigating that as the complainant. So thank you. Absolutely. So let's see here. So again, just like you said, you'd find out if the resident has a representative who can speak on behalf of the resident, and then inform the representative of the need to involve outside individuals such as facility staff or whoever the investigative agency is, and explain the role of the Ombudsman program, and then work with that individual to develop a plan of action. So again, just like I said, if the resident does not have a representative, or that representative can't be reached, or they're not acting in the best interest of the resident, then the resolution goal is for action by the state licensing and certification agency, APS, or whoever that investigation agency is. Then the ombudsman should seek approval from the state ombudsman and follow policies and procedures after that. So thank you. Okay, so the last case is that an ombudsman receives a complaint regarding abuse via email or a phone call from an individual other than the resident. I'd like to know how you would proceed with that. So I'll give you a couple seconds to type in an answer or to raise your hand. Just 1 second. Okay, Gloria, I see your hand raised. I'm not sure if it's raised to respond to this question, but if it is, I'm going to unmute your line and let you respond. If not, then that's fine, and I can mute it again.
Okay. I don't know what's happening to raise my hand.
That's fine. I'll go ahead and unmute it then.
If you receive a call, we always respond to a call no matter who it's from. And I would contact the resident and make sure that they really have this complaint. Not just go out there and ask them, do you have this complaint, but go out and visit and see if this comes up. And then if they do have the complaint, go ahead and work it. A lot of times complaints like this come in and they're anonymous, and the resident doesn't really have this complaint.
Right.
In that case, it won't come up while you're talking to the resident and you've just made a friendly visit.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Gloria. And I did lower your hand, so in this last case, but I appreciate you answering me whenever I call on you. All right. Yes, and Howard also said the same thing. Check with the resident first before taking any action, so thanks for sending that in. Also received another typed message that said it would depend on the level of competency of the resident. If the resident's able to give consent, then I'd make my visit to the resident and carefully open dialogue regarding the concern. Then let the complainant know I visited with the resident. If the resident's unable to give consent, then I'd probably work with social services or administration, or possibly the guardian, conservator, or DPOA. So you'll notice, thank you so much for sending that in, Jan. You'll notice in a lot of these responses and in the resources that I'm going to talk about in a few slides that there's a similar pattern to these advocacy strategies. And we asked this question in the cases because we want ombudsmen, just to reiterate, that ombudsmen are not supposed to be considered the primary investigators of abuse or neglect. So ombudsmen, if you do receive a call or an email from someone that's not the resident, you should inform them of the role of the ombudsman investigating these type of complaints, and you could provide contact information for the appropriate entity that does that investigation. So whether that's the state survey agency or adult protective services, depending on the setting. Then the ombudsman should visit the resident who may be at risk, just like all of you said. And then, of course, we have that caveat that if the resident does not give the ombudsman permission, then you could follow the procedure like we did in the first case study, or if the resident doesn't have consent, then you would want to work through their legal representative and so on and so forth. You would definitely want to consult with your supervisor and or the state ombudsman or program policies in order to follow additional investigation and advocacy steps. And simply, regardless of how the complaint is received, the ombudsman should always seek resident permission before pursuing the complaint and then proceed accordingly. So I think that we've got that down based on the responses that you've either typed in or shared or given us over the phone. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with that. As stated earlier, ombudsmen do not investigate complaints, including allegations of abuse, to determine if a law or regulation was violated or to enforce a penalty. So therefore, ombudsmen are not generally considered the primary entity to investigate allegations of resident abuse. And that is one of those things, especially as states try to look at their state policies and procedures based on the final ombudsman program rule. There's a lot of change that's happening in states across the country in response to this rule, and having to explain to whether it's APS or state survey agencies or even AAAs, wherever the local programs are housed, about the role of the ombudsman program. So as I said before, in this presentation and all the resources that we're sharing, they all are consistent with the message in the Older Americans Act and the final rule. So you can draw from the language in this whenever you're trying to explain to somebody what the role of the ombudsman program is related to abuse. So I hope you find that helpful. So like I said, we are going to have time for some open question and answers, especially if I didn't answer that question about always needing resident permission to investigate abuse. So feel free, raise your hand. It doesn't have to just be about the cases. You can raise your hand or send in a chat message with any questions related to this topic that we've discussed today. Howard, I see that your hand is raised, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute your line. I'm not sure if it's for Q&A or for the last cases. But did you have a question for me, Howard?
Well, yes, I do. When exactly was this quote's final rule implemented?
It hasn't fully been implemented yet. So it was published in February 2015, and states have until July 1st, I believe, 2016 to come into compliance with the rule. So there's, states were given time to figure out, interpret what the rule means, get technical assistance. So NORC, my role at the National Ombudsman Resource Center, is actually to provide a lot of technical assistance to states about implementing the final rule. And so we're all kind of in the middle of implementation right now because it's not effective until July 2016.
So,
or June.
so maybe this is for Barbara, but what does that mean to us in Kansas right at this moment?
Well, Bates, what it means is that we're still, looking at our policies and procedures with regard to, well, to this and a few other things. We're in Kansas. I think we have an organizational structure that makes the final rule maybe a little less of a change for us than maybe some other states. But we do have a few minor things that we need to look at with our policies and procedures, and we're working on that.
Okay,
Well,
so this is mainly informational for us, and we're still doing exactly what we've been doing and not changing our role in any way.
I think that as to me, the rule really really clarifies what the Older Americans Act's intentions were all along. So I'm not, certainly our policy and procedures, the ones you follow are the ones we have in place right now. But our policies and procedures do, so I'm not sure what difference you're talking about, Bates. Our policies and procedures currently tell us we need approval to work a case, and that includes abuse as well. So
right.
that's not a big difference.
Okay, well, I guess I've kind of taken that, gotten that impression that it isn't. I mean, what we're doing now isn't that much different than what the quote's final rule says.
No, I think it helps us to clarify a few things. I think, I don't know that we've ever really had a sense of what to do if we're the ones that witness abuse. And I think that's maybe something that helps us to clarify that. And that's, we've not really had a policy that addressed what we do if someone witnesses abuse, or one of our representatives witness abuse. But so I think it gives us an opportunity to know now better what to do.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah. Howard, great question, and thank you for your response, Barbara. Yes, the Older Americans Act, that law has been around for years, explaining very clearly that the Ombudsman program needs to take action that is resident-directed and with permission of the resident. However, some states have been investigating abuse as if they are state surveyors or adult protective services and acting as the fact finder of abuse. So if your program has not been doing that, great. But like Barbara said, the final rule really just reiterates and clarifies what the intent of the Older Americans Act was all along. So we can get all programs across the country acting in a consistent manner in response to allegations of abuse, because there has been a variety of responses. And I think there's still, even in states that had clear policies and procedures about needing resident consent, even in allegations of abuse, I think there's still some confusion out there, like Barbara said, in what happens if you witness it, or what happens if you don't have consent, and so on and so forth. So it just really provides more clarification for ombudsman programs, and that's what I'm trying to explain today, and how it applies to your daily work as an ombudsman, how it translates down to field work. So thanks for your question. And for example, we had a question that just came in. If we witness physical abuse, I thought we were supposed to contact the state office immediately, not try and get permission. I'm not sure, great question. I'm not sure what your policies are, but yes, you can, since you're sharing information with the state office, I assume you mean the state ombudsman, and that's within the ombudsman program, then I think you would do both of those almost simultaneously. Get permission from the resident, see how to proceed, and call the state office as soon as you can. So I see those two things really coming hand in hand.
I agree. Thank you.
So, yeah, so good question. Thank you. Are there any other questions before I move to close and share some resources?
I think David Wilson has his hand up.
Yeah, I just saw that. Great, thank you. I'm going to unmute your line, David. Go ahead.
Okay. I guess my question is very succinctly, is there ever a time that we can report abuse without the concurrence of the resident, with the okay from the resident? Is there ever a time when we can have to move around that? Is it, if we observe the abuse, is that a situation where we should proceed even without the resident's permission?
Yeah. Again, great question. No. If, kind of like we discussed with the first case about not giving consent, if you don't have consent, even in a situation where you witness it, you need to find another approach in how to respond to that. So,
even when we see it, we actually, as an ombudsman, observe it. We cannot act. Obviously, we report it to the state ombudsman, but beyond that, we can't do anything until we have gotten either somebody else that's maybe observed it or experienced it. As you've outlined in the other earlier parts of the presentation. So we really can't do anything until we explore that or find somebody else that may be observed that would be willing to speak or something.
Yes, but if you think about it too, if you actually witness it, then it's usually something that you need, I am assuming something that you need to stop. So if you're walking down the hallway and you witness a staff person, slap a resident, then my first instinct, and I think anyone, whether you're an ombudsman or anyone, would be to make sure that someone notices that's happening. So in that situation, in that immediate situation, you can call attention to it. Wouldn't you walk up and say, stop that, or there's a DON in the hall, you would call attention to the situation and then proceed, because your first reaction would be to protect that individual. So, I can't really think of a situation, if you're witnessing it, that your first reaction wouldn't be to stop it. And in stopping it, you would be approaching the resident saying, I just saw what happened, how do you want me to proceed? I mean, it would all be that immediate. Does that make sense?
You can't necessarily then speak to the staff member to say stop it.
If the staff member is...
If you do that and you were to say that, this hasn't happened, but I'm just saying what if you were to say to the employee, stop doing that, then that employee will go to their boss and you're likely to get into a situation. I'm just saying, is that a permissible activity for us to intercede in stopping that as we see it going on?
So I'm going to answer this really quickly, and then I'm going to pass it to Barbara, just because that's a program policy and procedure more question, I think. But in this document that I'm going to talk about in a couple minutes, at the Resource Center, everything has to get approved by our grantor, which is the Administration on Aging. There's language in there based on this specific case, if you witness abuse, how to proceed, and the language was approved by the Administration on Aging. And it does say, call attention to the situation. If that means, telling the staff to stop it, calling attention to another staff person in order to have them witness it, get all those immediate parts moving, and then work with the resident and how they want to proceed from there. The first instinct would be to stop it and protect the individual, and then you kind of sort out the ombudsman activity after that. So I think there's a whole lot kind of in theory, and then when you break it down into practice, that's when the minutia of the program policies and procedures kick in. So does that make sense? And Barbara, would you kind of approve or, do you have any feedback on that approach?
Yes, that's exactly what I see as the right thing to do, is to intervene and stop it from continuing to occur. That's certainly something we'd want to do. And then, if that turns into a thing that the resident doesn't want us to investigate, and yet somehow the staff starts to try to involve us in what happened, and we can't have that conversation, we'll work on that later, and we'll figure that out later. And that may be where you need to call your regional and Army into the situation as well. So that we can offer support and guidance and advice.
Yeah, and David, thanks so much for asking that question and having me drill down a little deeper into it. I really appreciate that, because that language, again, I mean, since it's a final rule, it's federal regulations, that kind of action item is not going to be in the regulation language. So that's why that's not on that slide. But the resource that I talked about in a couple slides, it's specifically listed in there as an action and advocacy step. So I hope that.
I guess, Amy, the other thing I would add is that we're, in the scenario you're talking, David, the resident has the ability to give consent. If the resident does not, there's some other things that we can do, and we've kind of talked about those earlier as well.
Right. Yep. Yeah, great question. Thank you so much. Okay, well, if it sounds good to you all, I'm going to move on to go ahead and close out and talk about these resources that I've been talking about. And like I said, Barbara knows how to contact me, or any of you can contact me directly with questions after this. So I wanted to talk a little bit about systems advocacy, because as you know, and as you heard from the Older Americans Act language, that is a primary responsibility of the Ombudsman program, not just the Ombudsman program as a whole, but getting individual ombudsmen involved in systems advocacy. So if you manage an ombudsman program locally, I encourage you to review your complaint data regularly, identify areas for education, collaboration, and advocacy, whether that means you join a regional elder abuse task force, or you share information with residents and families and staff about perhaps resident-to-resident mistreatment, like we just talked about. Those numbers are really high. Or financial exploitation. Those cases are also really high by individuals other than facility staff, kind of working through systemically how you can help reduce those incidents. Remind long-term care facilities of their role in preventing, reporting, and responding to abuse. For example, nursing homes are required to report reasonable suspicion of a crime, which would involve abuse. And I have the survey insert date and number right there for you. Consult with your supervisor and or the state ombudsman in trying to figure out how your advocacy could fit into a systems advocacy plan. And then you would also want to review available resources regarding systems advocacy. We have a lot of those on our website. So if you're training your volunteers on what exactly systems advocacy is, what it looks like, how they can even get involved, and then of course there's the National Consumer Voice for Quality Long-Term Care, and there's a lot of advocacy opportunities with that organization. So I try to address some touchstones of basic ombudsman roles and role and responsibility in all of these presentations that I do. So specifically, some important touchstones about the ombudsman role in responding to abuse complaints that you can walk away with today is that the ombudsman approach is always person-centered when it comes to complaint processing. The resolution role is resident satisfaction and the protection of residents' health, welfare, and rights. The Ombudsman program is not supposed to be the official finder of fact to substantiate abuse complaints. You're not there to prove that abuse happened and that specific regulations or requirements were violated. You're there to support the resident and follow their goal and wishes. Ombudsmen are also not mandatory reporters, but ombudsmen must support the resident to the extent the resident wants your assistance. So those are some important take-home messages for you today. Some resources I wanted to share related to abuse. We have the Consumer Voice worked with the National Center for Elder Abuse on this document talking about resident-to-resident mistreatment. This is a really great consumer brochure that you can share with facilities, residents, family members. It defines abuse, neglect, and exploitation, provides an overview of resident rights, defines resident-to-resident mistreatment, and explains how an individual could seek help, including reaching out to the Ombudsman program if they feel that they have been victims of resident-to-resident mistreatment or any other mistreatment. Sorry about that. My mouse is going a little crazy. Okay, there we go. The technical assistance guide that I drew a lot of information from and that I kept referring to, especially in response to David's question, is the Technical Assistance Guide Responding to Allegations of Abuse, Role and Responsibilities of Ombudsman. There are, if I remember correctly, there are 6 cases, 3 of which we discussed today, and then with action steps and how to proceed. And one of those cases does talk about if an ombudsman witnesses abuse. So it goes into greater detail like we discussed today with stopping the situation and then proceeding from there. So that's an excellent resource and the URL is there for you. We also, a couple years ago, Consumer Voice worked with NCA, the National Center for Elder Abuse, on creating some consumer fact sheets regarding financial exploitation. They are in English and Spanish, and they're also, we have separate documents for residents of nursing homes, and then family members with residents in nursing homes, and then residents of assisted living and their family members. So there are several different documents, and there's also a document that coincided with that one called 10 Things Ombudsman Can Do in Order to Prevent Financial Exploitation. So please check out those resources. The link is there for you. We have another resource that NORC is working on, and it's in the final phase of approval, about ombudsman advocacy specifically related to resident-to-resident aggression. I don't know about you, but I knew it was an issue, but when I looked at the national data to see how many complaints there were about resident-to-resident aggression, I was really, really surprised how high it was. And so this talks about it, it defines it, identifies risk factors, and then provides recommendations to both prevent and reduce incidents of resident-to-resident aggression, and then discusses ombudsman strategies. So this should be available in the near future, so please keep your eye out for that, because I think it'll be a great resource for you. And of course, if you want additional information about abuse, any kind of training, we have all of our webinars are recorded and on our website, and we also have in-service materials that you can take out to facilities and provide training. They're all available on our website. So that was my presentation. I know I went pretty quickly at the end, but I had a lot of information to share with you. My contact information is on this slide. Feel free to let me know if you have any questions after today. And thank you, Barbara, for including me today. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for doing what you're doing every day out in the field.
Thank you very much, Amity. And I would also like to make sure that everyone knows that if they've got additional questions we didn't get answered that I can help with, don't hesitate to call or email me with your questions, and we'll get that. Or certainly for the volunteers, if you want, you can talk to your regionals as well. No, they'd be happy to answer your questions, but I am as well. So I know we've probably ran through maybe and missed a question, maybe or two, and so I want to make sure that folks know that they have that opportunity. So anyway, thank everybody for joining today, and thank you, Amity, for presenting for us today. Really appreciate it. It's unfortunate that this is such an important topic for us to talk about, but it is, and I'm grateful for your expertise on the topic. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So
bye, everyone.
Goodbye, everyone, and have a wonderful weekend.
Take care.
Bye.